My name is Danu. I'm a product specialist for Dimensions based here in Auckland in New Zealand. It's my great pleasure to be speaking with you today, and hopefully you can now see my screen. Excellent. So my intention today is to, first of all, spend a few moments to introduce Dimensions to you and what we're trying to accomplish with Dimensions, what our ambition is, what you can do with it. And then I'll be taking you through the platform in a variety of live examples to look at some things that I think hopefully will be interesting to you around particularly exploring the funding landscape, looking at SDGs and social impact and areas of emerging research. So I'm hoping also it can be quite an interactive and two-way discussion. So as we go along, feel free to put any questions you have in the chat and we'll get to them, and we'll have time for questions. I'm happy to look at things in the platform that you would like to suggest as well. So without any further ado, I'll get straight into it. So a brief overview of Dimensions. Dimensions, for those of you who haven't seen it before, is quite a new database. We built it from the ground up a few years ago because we realized there was a need for a new modern kind of database that reflected the new modern research landscape. And what I mean by that in this new normal is that we have recognized some important trends that are happening. And these trends have really been accelerated by the COVID pandemic, as we all know. So some of those things are around the speed and rapidity of publication. This little graph here shows the time from when a paper is accepted to when it's published online, and how that has been decreasing and decreasing over the last few years as we see more real-time publishing essentially, and use of things like preprints. We know that there's great pressure on institutions to be finding new sources of funding and diversified funding streams and to make better use of existing resources, and to increasingly contextualize the research that we're doing. It's not just about having more research or more citations, it's about being able to show impact and collaboration in those increasingly global and multidisciplinary frameworks. And the Sustainable Development Goals are a good example of that in the context of global research challenges. So all this means that there's a great desire for more data-led approaches that will help universities differentiate themselves and really start to identify unique areas of strength and capability that can craft a scholarly narrative, and to do this quicker than ever before. So we recognize that there is lots of data available. A lot of it exists within our own institutions, but it's often quite hard to work with because it lives in different systems, or it doesn't quite join up, or it takes a long time to get it in a form where you can work with it. So there's a real need for data that's joined up and ready to work with and ready to answer questions. So that's really what we're trying to accomplish with Dimensions, because we think that those who thrive in this kind of environment are going to be the best at joining the dots. The other important thing that we wanted to acknowledge with Dimensions is the broader view of the research landscape itself. So for a long time, our traditional ways of looking at research information have been about publications and citations. We've got very well developed, sophisticated metrics around these, like citation counts and H indexes, field-weighted citation impact, journal impact factor. All these indicators that we're very familiar with are all based on the publication and citation relationship. And of course, that continues to be important. But there's a lot more going on in the research landscape than just this. So if we zoom out and have a look at what else there is to know, we can see straight away there's a lot to look at. And so publications are a reflection of research that has already happened, of course. Increasingly, there's a large interest in looking at the leading indicators of research, like grants that are being funded and what projects are coming down the pipe that are going to result in research and IP and clinical trials and so on. So it's important to look at the funding picture, and then also important to look at the different kinds of publications and publishing that is happening, whether that be preprints and the life that they have, or also data sets and the increasing importance of people publishing data alongside their research to aid in open science and reproducibility. And not just publications and citations inside the academy, but also the whole question of how research is discussed and disseminated outside the academy in news, in social media, in the practitioner blog space, and other kinds of dissemination channels like this. And of course, we have seen this very much since COVID, how science is very much back in the public eye, and the way that research is discussed publicly is very important, as well as the way it's discussed inside the academy. And then, of course, there's how knowledge makes its way into IP in the form of patents or about tech transfer, and knowledge transfer into things like policy documents. So we want to be able to look at this whole research story, and this is really what we've been doing with Dimensions. Dimensions joins up this picture by bringing together all of this data at once. So you can see that in Dimensions we have publications, we have information on funded projects, we have data sets, global patent database, clinical trials, policy documents, and altmetric information, which is about how research is discussed outside the academy. And probably more importantly than having just this data is the way that we link it up to make it a joined up picture. And the way we do this is using really modern data curation and processing techniques. What we're doing, for instance, is using natural language processing and machine learning to categorize everything that comes into Dimensions at the article level according to community standard schemes of classification, like the Australia-New Zealand Field of Research Codes, the UK Units of Assessment, the National Institute of Health Research Condition and Disease Classification, the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, and others. We're also identifying and disambiguating all of the organizations and researchers across all of these different types of content and linking them up. So this means you can do things like see which publications result from which grants, which clinical trials have cited which publications, which preprints have gone on to become publications, and how those are funded. All of those different relationships between the documents can be brought together. And we're also analysing the text of publications and documents to create a concept model that's all done automatically that helps us do some quite powerful searching and analysis, which I'll be able to show you later on. All of this to say, the result is that we have clean, organized, interlinked data that's ready for reporting, ready for analysis, and ready for you to ask questions of it. So when we think about where Dimensions sits among other databases that you may be familiar with, we think Dimensions is really the largest and most diverse database of research information and insight in the world. And we position it slightly different to other databases. So for instance, we know We know that academics really like to use Google Scholar because of its inclusive coverage and how easy it is to work with. But we also know that Google Scholar's data is quite difficult to work with. It's lacking clear and consistent metadata. It's not really suitable for robust analysis. Whereas other databases that we are well aware of are very good at starting with a curated set of data and having clean metadata to work with. We really want to have the best of both worlds. We want to have clean, consistent metadata that's good for analysis and very robust, but also very broad, inclusive coverage, not just of publications, but of all of these other types of content as well. So we think that puts Dimensions in a fairly unique space. And now that Dimensions has been out for a couple of years, there's starting to be a growing independent literature comparing it with other tools and databases to see how it stands up. And that's really interesting and very interesting for us to see that happen. Here's a good example of one of those from the Scientometrics journal a couple of months ago now. I'm looking at the journal coverage of Web of Science, Scopus, and Dimensions, and finding that of all of them, Dimensions has the most exhaustive coverage of journals. And when this is paired with the ability to slice and dice and zoom into the particular part of the publication landscape that you're interested in and use different quality filters, that's very powerful and promising, as the author puts it. So when we think about how Dimensions actually gets used, we find that it's the sort of tool that's really for the whole institution. It's not designed to sit in a particular office and be very expensive and used by 5 or 6 people. It's really a tool for everyone, and there are lots of different use cases for it around different parts of the institution. So researchers and research leaders in faculties and schools and centres find it very accessible to do kinds of analysis that have previously been quite challenging for them, to do things like strategic recruitment, analyse trends, and look for collaborators. When it comes to the library, there's great interest in analysing collections and making sure those are optimised, validating open access policies, and supporting researchers with great discovery tools. And when it comes to research office and strategy, there's a lot of interest in using Dimensions, again, for strategic recruitment and collaboration, for informing research strategy, not just by the usual metrics that we're familiar with, but with a whole host of new questions that have not been possible to ask before. And that in particular includes the funding landscape piece. So you can see there are lots of different things. We won't talk about them all today, but very happy to talk about any of them in depth if it's interesting to you. And the last thing to say as part of the intro is that we think a new kind of database requires a new kind of delivery method as well. Universities haven't had access to this kind of data joined up in this way before. And so we think we have to provide new ways of making this data available. So the way that we do this is we have different ways of getting to the Dimensions data. We have a web app, which is what we're going to be looking at in just a moment, which is really designed to help you navigate through the research landscape and discover and do quick analysis very quickly, allow you to change contexts and get quick insights on the fly, and in particular is designed for anyone to be able to use without having a lot of bibliometrics background or analytics experience. So we think it does most of the things most people want to do most of the time. But we're not trying to build a web application that can do everything or be all things to all people, because it would be very messy, very confusing, and just wouldn't be possible. We think there is so much you can do when you have this data together, but actually we need to have more direct ways of accessing the data in ways that make sense to clients. So we put a lot of effort into having strong direct data access tools like a Dimensions API, and also access to bulk data, which institutions would used to have got on big hard drives once every year or so, and then taken a long time to integrate it with existing systems. But we have a really revolutionary new way of offering this by putting our whole data set onto Google BigQuery, Google's cloud platform, so that you can do very fast, large-scale analysis, join it with other data sets that you have, and be building your own custom dashboards and visualizations very quickly without needing to spend months and months on ingesting the data or having a big team of people to do that. So that's something we're very excited about and happy to talk about as well. So that's all by way of introducing what Dimensions is. And just to give you an example of what this looks like in practice, this sort of joined up picture with real-time analysis and custom dashboards, I thought I'd show you our real-time COVID-19 dashboard, which we've built on Dimensions data using Dimensions on Google BigQuery. What's interesting about COVID-19 research is how rapidly it is disseminated and how much of it there is. And you can see this happen week by week, the publications come out. So we have built a query that picks up COVID-19 publications and a dashboard that lets us explore these. So here is the timeline of COVID-19 publications from when the pandemic started, week by week. You can see in the early weeks of the pandemic the huge importance of preprints to the research story. And those have remained sort of constant in terms of volume, although not proportionally when you look at journal articles overall. But really interesting to see this growing research. And it is such a global effort. And it is a multidisciplinary effort, although, of course, we think of health and clinical research. There is a lot of other angles involved as well. Social science research, education and economics all coming into play as well. And as I understand that social science and health clustering is something that you're very interested in at MU, I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on how you think about and measure that. So that's something we can get to later. If we just sort of zoom into the picture of our research for a moment, though, we can see, again, that interdisciplinary picture, that biological science is the next discipline alongside health that's joined. And then we can see, of course, a heavy preponderance of MU research in this space where that's being published. And the open access story of that research is quite interesting to see as well. Of course, most of it is open access of one kind or another. And then you can see, if you sort these by year, the publications as they come out, essentially, and go and click into the individual articles. So you can see those, but you can also see the clinical trials picture. Just loading up. And the huge number of clinical trials, just under 10,000 now, being run in the COVID-19 space. And where those are happening as well. we can see what those clinical trials are as well. And then finally, the funding piece and the huge effort to fund COVID-19 research. So $5.5 billion and 8,000 grants. Really an explosion of research. These are just the awarded projects that we know about. And of course, this is an even more interdisciplinary space of funding, because there are so many aspects to consider. So we can see who the funders are and where that funding is being awarded and which organizations are involved in funded research. And then the individual grants and how much they are and when they run. So all of this to say, this becomes your real-time dashboard for COVID-19 research. And because it's built in such a flexible way, you could, of course, use a tool like Dimensions to build any kind of dashboard similar to this for any topic that you are interested in. And we do indeed have a tutorial for how you can do this on our website. It takes about 2 or 3 hours to do, and you can build something like this. So that's just my overview of what we're trying to do with Dimensions. We're doing something a bit different. It's quite ambitious, and I hope that that gives you some flavour of what we're trying to do. Now, I've got quite a few things to show you in the platform, in the web app, but I thought I would just pause here for a moment and see if anyone has any questions or observations before I continue. So I'll just pause for a moment.
I cannot see any question on the floor, Danu.
Yeah, I'm just having a look. Okay, well, if there are any, feel free to ask them as we go along, but I'll start using the app now. So, if I go into Dimensions, this is the Dimensions web application. And we have a search bar at the top here, and we can see all of the different types of content that we have, the results here in the middle, and then we use filters down the left-hand side to slice and dice what we want to see, and we get some analysis on the right-hand side as we go that reflects what we're searching for. So I wanted to show you a couple of workflows that will take us around the platform and give us an idea of what kinds of things you can do with a few clicks and a few minutes. So if I have a look at an interesting topic and I just do a keyword search, maybe I will look for metabolomics. Now, if I'm using a normal or another database, I'd be normally searching in the title and abstract of papers. So if I do that, you can see that we return around 46,000 publications, quite a few data sets, some grants and patents, clinical trials, and so on. One of the things about Dimensions is we actually have the full text indexed of the vast majority of publications in our database. And so we can search through the full data of publications to get a much more broad view on the topic. And so straight away you can see we're able to see many more publications that have something to do with metabolomics. So you may want to use a full data or a title and abstract search depending on what kind of search and discovery you want to do. Why don't we have a look now at a research organization group. So we have some research organization groups built into Dimensions. For example, here's the ASEAN University Network. So if we just zero in on that and have a look at the AUN institutions, then we can see there's about 3,000 metabolomics publications. If we open up our analytical view now, we can come down to the research organizations and see who's working on metabolomics research in AUN. And what we're looking at here is numbers of publications and raw citations and average citations per paper. So we can see MU is doing quite well here. But we have some other kinds of metrics inside Dimensions as well. So rather than just looking at raw citations, we can look at something like a field citation ratio, which normalizes out the citations per discipline. So you can see, for instance, a field citation ratio of 1 means that this is getting the average number of citations you would expect for this discipline per year. And we can see that MU's metabolomics publications are a little over 3 times the citation average, which is really nice. So then what we can do is have a look at the other sorts of things in the publication space. Just while we're here, we can see where this research is being published in terms of journal articles and journals and conferences and so on. We can see the open access story of this research and how, as is usually the case, open research tends to receive more citations than closed research. We can see that story. We can also do things like have a look at timelines. And see how, this is a little bit noisy, but we can see those, we take off these different types of open access. We can see the open access research overtook closed in metabolomics in the AUN network back in 2014 and has been accelerating since. So that's quite interesting. And maybe we want to have a look at the funding landscape for metabolomics. And in particular, we may be wanting to look even more specifically at metabolomics and an emerging research topic in that space. I'll just take off AUN here. So let's have a look at metabolomics and multiomics. So now we can see publications, but we want to go and have a look at the grants space. And Dimensions has grants information because we have direct relationships with over 600 funders worldwide. And this means that we can get information like the project abstract, the amounts, the named investigators, the organizations that are involved and the timeframes and so on. So we're increasing that list of funders all the time. So if we have a look at the grants that we know about, these are funded projects, not funding opportunities in the metabolomics and multi-omics space. We can open up the analytics views and get a bit of a view of the landscape. So if I come to overview, I can see there's a significant spike of growth in the number of grants that are active in this space and that are starting as well. And I can look at that in terms of the actual funding amount for this research, which is really growing over the last few years. I have my currency set to New Zealand dollars, but you can have it in whatever currency makes sense to you. Then you can go and have a look at things like the individual funders who are funding this research and say, well, of that, a lot of it is coming from the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Disease. Around 209 million is involved in this. If we open up a chart for this funder, what we're looking at here is this is the funder's total budget of everything they fund, and this is what proportion of that is funding our search, which is metabolomics and multiomics. I can take off that first line, and that lets us really see the funding story. So there's growth there, and we can do this for any of the funders. This is a very pronounced growth story here. We can, of course, go in and see what these grants are about, which I'll do in a moment. But we can also have a look at this by categories. So I mentioned that we categorize everything at document level in Dimensions automatically using machine classification techniques. And we use the same classifications across publications, grants, and patents, which means it's really easy for you to do consistent disciplinary analysis across these different types of content. So if we have a look at the disciplinary split of funding for this kind of research, we can see where it lives. This is the default classification scheme that we use, the field of research. We can see, for instance, that there's a particular slice of this that's about computing and information. But sometimes with a field like this, it can be more useful to use a more specific classification, like maybe the research condition and disease one from the National Institute of Health. And that can give us a clearer idea of what this funding is about and where it is segmented. And then we can start to do things like look at a heat map and get a very quick sense of, we've got our categories of grant funding down the side, and then here we've got which funders are funding which kind of research. So that gives us a bit of a sense there. And for any of these kinds of graphs and visualizations, you can export the graphs, and you can also export the underlying data and go take it out to Excel or another platform to look at more closely. It doesn't have to be funders on the columns. You could look at this any number of ways. So for instance, we might look at countries. And say, well, of these different kinds of research in metabolomics and multiomics, where is the funding going to? So a lot of it's happening in the US, but there are particular specializations in other countries in particular areas. So we can get that quick sense of the landscape with a couple of clicks. And then what we can do is actually peer into the future a little bit. At the moment, we're looking at all grants for all time here. But if we wanted to be more specific to look at what's happening right now, we could use the active year filter here to look at projects that will be active any time from now onwards. And so this tells us about research that's happening right now. And so here's some good examples of specific grants. Maybe we can open up one of them Here's one that's quite large. And just have a look at what kind of information is there. So this one's from the Israeli Science Foundation, and we've got the principal investigator and the co-PI. The particular abstract they've included is not very fulsome in this case, but normally you have the project there and the amounts and when it's running. And for these, this is obviously a very new piece of research, so there hasn't been time to be lots of publications resulting from it yet, but as those start to come out, we would link those here on this page as well. So this can be useful because we can now see for the research that's going on right now, things like who are the organizations that hold this funding or that are involved in these projects? Do we recognize any of them? Are they people that we have an existing relationship with who may be eligible to access funding? Are they people who we may wish to form a relationship with? And not just the organizations, but the individual researchers, the named investigators. We can see who they are and go have a look at their profiles as well. So that's one example of how you can look at funding information and get some quite powerful insights very quickly. I'll show you another example of this, which will take us into a slightly different space. So I used a keyword search here for metabolomics and multi-omics. I could get quite specific topic searching without using keywords at all, just relying on dimensions auto classification at article level. So let's have a look at that. In the area of, if we just zoom in for a moment to MU's profile in dimensions, then we can pick a topic off the back of that. I'm just going to come down to research organization here. Pull up MU. And here we can see quite a fulsome profile with lots of different types of content in that we could explore. I'm just going to come over to the analytics pane. And now let's have a look at that disciplinary split on those RCDC classifications we were looking at. Of course, MU has a very strong health base, so there's lots to look at here. And we can see the citations again, and that gives us already a bit of an idea of areas of strength. I'm going to use that field citation ratio just to highlight that and let that pop a little bit. So we can see everything's very highly rated and above average. There are some areas that stand out, like malaria research with a high FCR. So we could just have a look and zoom in at malaria research. And again, this is all automatically classified at document level. So this is MU's malaria research. We can see that's quite steady in terms of publication volume over the years. And you can see had quite a few clinical trials. We can pop over to clinical trials just for a moment to have a look what's in there. And see what those are, who the researchers are who are involved, and the collaborating funders, and the collaborators themselves, and where all those collaborations are taking place. So that's quite interesting to see. We can sort this by clinical trial status and so on. I won't spend too much time here just to show you that it's there. If I come back to publications, if we have a look at, we're looking at MU's malaria publications at the moment, but if we take off MU now and just have a look at malaria research generally, actually, my apologies, I'll leave MU on, and I just want to quickly jump over to the grants space again. So what we can see is that MU has been involved in a number of grants that we know about that are malaria related. And when we have a look at the graph here, we can see that was the case previously, but that's perhaps petered out a little bit in recent years. So if we have a look at the broader picture of this research, not just MU, but globally for malaria, we can see that it's steady, but also slightly in decline now, which is interesting. But what if we look at a particular slice of that malaria funding that might represent being paired with an emerging topic like we looked at before? So if we now pair this with, say, CRISPR, we can see it's a different story. And now of malaria research that's CRISPR related, the funding is steeply on the increase. So that might be quite interesting for us to take a look at. So if we're sorting these grants here by relevance at the moment, we can sort them by amount or start date, so and so. Let's just have a look at one of them. This one has more information on it than the other one that we had a look at. We can see the project summary here. We can also see that we've classified this grant automatically according to a lot of different classifications, including Sustainable Development Goal 3. So what if we wanted to say, well, this is malaria CRISPR research that's going on now. How well does this fit our expertise profile at MU? If this is something we wanted to look at, our malaria funding, which has tapered off a little bit lately, how could we get involved in this? So we could take the project summary here, and rather than build a complicated keyword search, we could actually, I'm just going to open a new tab to keep it simple. We could do something that Dimensions has called an abstract search. So we come up here and click abstract search. If we press enter here, what Dimensions is going to do is analyze that text, extract the concepts from it, again, using natural language processing and machine learning, and then look at the relationship of those concepts to each other and their relevance, compare that to everything in the database, and then bring back the most relevant content. So now we're looking at publications, grants, and patents based on that abstract from that malaria CRISPR project that we had open before. And so now what maybe we can do is come down to research organization again. And actually, MU is near the top of research in this space, which is quite interesting. And so really what we're doing here is seeing how well does our research profile match that topic that we've defined. And in fact, we have a huge amount of publication activity in this space to draw on, including very recent activity from this year. So if we wanted to have a look at this and see, well, who are our people here who may be the right profile for that kind of funding, we could open up our analytics pane and come to researchers. Now, because we're looking at publications, we're also going to see all the co-authors on those publications who may not be from MU, but we can just tick the box here to narrow that down to just the MU people. We can see we have quite a few. Again, looking at citations, it gives us a bit of an idea who's performing well in this space. Again, I like to use field citation ratio to just make that stand out a little bit more. So we can see, for instance, that this person has a very high field citation ratio in this topic that we've defined. So we could open up their profile in another tab. And find out a little bit more about this person who no doubt you already know. So now, because Dimensions is switching contexts, it's automatically updated all of our analysis and results based on what we're searching for. So if we wanted to go have a look at Ong's research profile in terms of disciplines and open access and journal titles and so on, all those screens that we've been having a look at already, you would see it would be updated. But what I wanted to show you on here is an individual researcher profile. So we have disambiguated around 75 million researchers in Dimensions, and for each one we create an author profile, a researcher profile, where we bring together everything we know about across all different types of content. So here we have Ong's 88 publications, many citations, and also some data sets. We can link out to the other identifiers. We've worked out the main areas in which they're working and also the main concepts that constitute their research platform. And that's all being done automatically. And here we're bringing in the ORCID record for experience and education. Looks like Ong is a postdoc. We can see the main co-authors, and they're from Oxford. And we can see the publications and data sets and whatever else a researcher has here. So this is quite interesting. Strong collaboration network with Oxford, not surprisingly, given Ong's background. I wonder if we come back to our funding landscape that we were looking at before, whether there is any funding in the area of malaria and CRISPR being awarded to Oxford. We can have a look at that. So we can, on the grant screen, come and have a look at research organisation. And here's Oxford. So there's one, it seems, that's just recently finished up. We could have a look at that. And see who that's with and what it's about. This one actually has some publications resulting from it. So we can see those here as well. And maybe this is an opportunity for some kind of collaboration or way of accessing funding. So, of course, you will know your researchers and your research profile much better than I do as an outsider. My intention here is just to show you the kind of insights that you can get within a few minutes just by clicking around inside Dimensions. So with the power of your own business knowledge, no doubt you'll be able to get some really powerful insights quite quickly. So that was just a little bit of clicking around inside Dimensions to show you how we can get that information quickly. Now, I'd quite like to show you something quite different, which is how we can create some custom dashboards built on Dimensions data to look at particular views on the data, depending on what we want to have a look at. So what I've got for us to see is a sample report that does a bit of benchmarking with MU against other institutions in Thailand. This is built in Dimensions on Google BigQuery and visualized in Google Data Studio. And I think the thing I would stress about this is a sample dashboard. It took us about 2 days to put this together. One of the great things about Dimensions is you can ask a question rather than start with, well, these are the metrics that we get because this is what comes with the platform and this is what we're used to. You can actually have the freedom to say, well, what if we were able to ask about this, this, and this, and then we can build something off the data that helps to answer those questions. So as we have a look at this, just think about what kinds of questions you might want to ask, what graphs or visualizations you might be interested to see, and then let's have a chat about it. It will be very interesting to workshop that with you. So I've just picked here some of the top institutions in Thailand for us to have a look at. On some metrics of benchmarking. We're going to have a look at this at the whole institution level. We can drill down onto a discipline level if we want to. Let's just stay on the whole institution for now. So we can see in terms of overall publications, there's a strong growth story happening for everyone, but particularly MU over the last 10 years. And we can have a look at things like publications per author, which has spiked a lot for everyone in the last year, perhaps reflecting the shift in research profile and emphasis to more collaborative research or more rapidity of research given the COVID situation. So we can see that. We can see something that we've called interdisciplinary publications. So every publication in Dimensions is tagged at the article level with a field of research, and those publications can have more than one field of research if they fit into different classifications. So if a publication has more than one of those, we'll call it a multidisciplinary publication, and this is looking at the split of those single versus multi ones. Then if we have a look at highly cited publications, we take all of the articles for that year in that discipline and look at globally which ones receive the most citations and then have a cutoff. We've set it to 5% by default. It could be anything at all that makes sense to you. We can see that there's a huge growth story in highly cited research at both MU and Chula over the last 10 years, which is no doubt reflected in the ranking story, which is very impressive for your institution, I have to say. and some of the institutions in my part of the world, in Australia and New Zealand, are looking at you with some fear, I think. So that's very impressive. And then, if we have a look at this at the top 1%, we can have a look what that picture looks like. And maybe it's more pronounced. Not sure. We'll see in a moment. All right, it's just taking a few seconds. So we can see MU has the edge here in top 1% cited papers, which is interesting to see. Then if we have a look of those top 1% papers, what is the disciplinary split of those? As you would expect, MU's is very strongly weighted towards medical and health sciences, whereas the others have a more balanced split across disciplines. So that reflects a very strong area of expertise. Then we can have a look at something like collaboration. And again, same institutions, full institutional view. This will pop up in a moment. Apologies for the delay here. I have too many tabs open on my screen, and it always runs a little bit slowly when I'm sharing my screen. I notice a question in the chat. I'll just come back to that at the end of this section, if that's okay. So here we're looking at types of collaboration. So whether it's international or within Thailand or within your own institution. So we can see MU has the highest proportion of international collaborations over this period, this last 10 years, and the smallest number of internal collaborations. So that's, when we have a look at that over time, no doubt a reflection of a deliberate research strategy. You can see that increase in international collaboration there. Jula's profile looks slightly different in that they've got a higher proportion of internal collaborations. And then if we have a look at which countries are we in fact collaborating with, what does that spread look like? We can see there's a fairly similar pattern across the institutions, a large proportion with the US, Japan, UK, slightly more even spread at Chula. And we could go and drill down and say, well, who are our collaboration partners in Australia, say? And we can always see those and go find out what those are about. Quickly see the others. I'll just click that off again. And then we can have a look at the different types of collaborations with different organizations. So while everyone has the highest proportion with educational institutions, of course, there are other types of institutions as well, governments and non-profits and corporates and healthcare, unsurprisingly. So we can see that split here. And then we can also start to look at what that looks like when you look at the citation performance of those different types of collaboration. So we can see spikes a little bit in your collaborations with non-profits perform very well in terms of citations compared to other types of publication collaborations that you do. some of these are spiked on very low numbers, so just bear that in mind. You can see Chula's is slightly higher on some of these. They have a very pointed emphasis on citations on their collaborations, it seems. So that's quite interesting. So again, that's just a sample dashboard that shows you some different ways of looking at the dimensions data. Some of that is probably things you've seen before in other platforms. Some of it might be slightly different. It's in no way fixed or what you have to have. Just an example. Would love to hear what kind of dashboard you would really like to have on hand, and maybe we could build a prototype for you. That would be quite interesting. I'm just going to address this question here. So Dimensions has a lot more records than Scopus and Web of Science, over 100 million. What are the reasons? Does Dimensions have any journal selection criteria? Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. I think what I'll say about that is a little slide that we can talk to. So we are taking quite a different approach to those other databases on purpose. We think that as a vendor, it's not really, as a data provider, it's not really our job to be deciding what you should see and what should be included in the platform. So we're not starting with a curated set of journals, and we're not imposing those value judgments onto those journals. So we actually index everything in Dimensions at article level rather than journal level, and we take an inclusive approach. So that means that we will see in Dimensions things like local journals that are not indexed in the other providers. You may see some things that would be called predatory journals in Dimensions. We do index those as well. We think that by having everything in there, you are able to then slice and dice it and look at the part of it that makes sense to you and be able to do different kinds of analysis that you couldn't do with less data. And of course, that means that we need to have tools available for you to easily do that. So for instance, you can see that we have this thing called a journal list filter in Dimensions. And these are, again, we don't want to be making arbitrary decisions or black box decisions about how to classify things. We do all our classifications based on community standards. So one really good way of doing that is to use national journal quality lists. So for instance, you can see the Australian Excellence for Research Australia journal list. You can filter on just things that are on that list. You can filter on the Nature Index journals and have a look at that narrow slice. You could conversely look at everything that was published in Thailand that wasn't on a journal quality list and have a look what that was about. And some interesting things are like these UGC lists here, Journal List 1 and 2 are from India's journal at the University Grants Commission. So UGC List 1 is essentially all of the India-specific content. So one of the reasons clients in India are getting really excited about Dimensions is it gives them visibility into some of their research that would not appear in other platforms. That's quite interesting. So you can see all of these local titles. The Indian Dermatology Online Journal, so on. And also the UGC List 2 from India is essentially based on the Scopus list. So you can use the UGC list 2 as a kind of proxy for looking at what the Scopus coverage is. So we think these kinds of things mean you can have the best of both worlds. And in terms of where the publication information actually comes from, that's a great question as well. So 2 places is the answer to that. We actually index a lot of public metadata sources like Crossref, PubMed, and other smaller, more specific ones. We get metadata from there, and then we augment that with direct relationships that we have with publishers. We have direct relationships with over 130 publishers, and we get additional metadata and also the full text indexing for the vast majority of those. And then we run all of our automatic processing on it and link it up with everything else. So I hope that answers your question, Richard. I'll pause and see if anyone else has any questions at this stage. I know we've seen a few things now. Yes, okay, so about the metrics. What are these metrics? Maybe you've seen them before, maybe you haven't. Great question. So again, I have a little slide about this. And somewhere. We have a number of standard metrics that are built into the platform. So we count citations, we have our own citation graph, and then we have something called recent citations, which is citations from the last 2 years. Field citation ratio is our own field normalized metric. If you are familiar with other tools like the field weighted citation impact, the FWCI from SciVal, or the CNCI from Insights, this is kind of our version of that. It's the same idea, but because we classify everything at article level, we end up with quite different results often, which we think are a little bit closer to, a little bit more precise on those disciplines. And when we have altmetric information as well, so that's a weighted algorithm based on the social media, news attention, Wikipedia citations, all that kind of non-academic citation stuff that gets pulled into a score and a percentage. We have the traditional journal metrics, the SNP and the Shimago journal ranking. I was showing you the highly cited metric before. We will have that actually in the platform soon. And if you want to know more about these, you can always press the About Indicators button in Dimensions and find out a little bit more about how we calculate them. I think the other thing to say about this is we think by having so much data available so flexibly, there's going to be a lot of interest in people making their own custom indicators. So we start to see some of this sort of thing where people are making cross metrics, joining Dimensions data with, say, World Bank data based on country income level and looking at the proportion of publications that we have with countries of different income levels and expressing that as a percentage. Those kinds of creative metrics are quite accessible to design and create in Dimensions. And so we'll see more of that. In fact, Nature Index itself is actually based on Dimensions data, and that is a set of custom indicators on top of Dimensions data, which is really interesting. Just to answer the last part of your question about the badge, let's have a look at that. So if I open up any article here, just so we can have a look, let's pick one with a lot of citations. Let's grab this. So we have these badges that sort of condense the metrics. You can get a little code snippet that means you can embed these badges on internal websites and publication repositories, which is a nice thing to do. When we open up these badges, we can see things like the number of citations. This one's not a good example of this. My apologies. The field citation ratio gets calculated on everything after 2000. So let's open up. Spread. Just an article for us to look at that will have the right kind of information for explaining. Let's take this one. Loading slowly. It's coming up now. Yeah, so let's open up the badge. So here we can see the number of citations, the number that have come recently, so it's still getting many citations, and then that field citation ratio. So we actually say this one is 509 times more cited than the average paper in its discipline for the year. And the relative citation ratio is the same idea as the field citation ratio, but it's calculated on a slightly different basis, just on the PubMed publications. It's actually a metric we designed for the National Institute of Health. And then we can go have a look at the citations over time and the disciplines that are contributing to the citations. That's the kind of thing you can see on the badge. We also have a Altmetric Badge, which lets you look at the ways that the research has been mentioned. So we can see news articles and Twitter, and it's been mentioned in some patents and some Facebook pages, Wikipedia, quite a broad base of things here. And if we look at the social media attention, we can see that it's coming from members of the public broadly, as well as actually some scientists and practitioners from various parts of the world. So this kind of badge you can use to go see the individual news mentions of the articles, the Facebook pages that mention the articles, where it has been cited in Wikipedia pages, and so on. So everything's very open and auditable and granular, so that you can see where the information comes from. Other questions that have come through. For institutional comparison, can I compare both the institute and the faculty? Yeah, that's a great question. So in Dimensions, we have organizations at the institutional level and individuals. And we give individuals and organizations their own unique identifier. So if you wanted to do faculty-based analysis for your own institution, what you would probably do is use our Dimensions API. You would have a list of your researchers and where they sit in your internal organizational chart. And then we would join that onto Dimensions data so you could assess their performance or join that up to look at the broader picture of research. We also have, you can do this the other way around. If you have an internal research management system where you're keeping track of your publications and research activity, you can actually use Dimensions data as a source into that using our metrics API or our CRIS system API. And that means that you can bring in Dimensions citation and performance information to your internal systems as well. So there are many different possibilities. So we can talk a bit more about the specifics of that if it's interesting to you. Another question is, I can't see some functions on my screen. Oh, yeah. So please explain the difference between the free version and the subscribed version. Yeah. So very important. We do offer a free version of Dimensions, which is designed for researchers, individual researchers specifically. We think that we're very committed to open science and that all researchers should have the opportunity to be looking at the research landscape. So in the free version, you can browse the entire set of global publications and data sets, and you can look at everything by fields of research and sustainable development goals. And then the kinds of things that institutions want to do for analysis, we put behind the paywall. So if you want to look at particular things at the organizational level, or you want to look at those other content types like grants and patents, clinical trials, those are included in the subscription version of Dimensions, as well as some extra kinds of analysis and filters that are more designed for research managers and administrators. So I can give you a chart that shows you the difference between versions, but you can do quite a bit with the free version. You can look at any articles in there and all the information for any of those. So I hope that helps. In regards to the price, many different variables go into that. That's, of course, something we can discuss perhaps off this call, and we can send you some pricing, but I won't do that on the call. I think I got all the questions there. I'm just scrolling through to make sure. Okay, that's good. How are we for time, Siddharaj?
We have 25 minutes left.
Okay. All right. So in that case, I'll show you a few more things in the platform. And let me come back to my screen. So let's have a look at the Sustainable Development Goals now. So I mentioned that we classify everything in Dimensions by all these different classification types, including SDGs. And we do this, again, using our machine language techniques. We worked with partners on a training set to train our algorithms. Other providers also do SDG classification, but we use a slightly different method that's not based on keywords. In other databases, it's keyword based. So if you search for something like climate change and you say climate change is an SDG term, then any paper that mentions climate change will be SDG related. But of course, people always talk about climate change in different contexts. It may not be related, it may not be specifically SDG aligned. So we're trying to do some more sophisticated analysis using natural language processing and clustering algorithms. So it means that we have a more selective view of what we would call an SDG related publication. So let me show you, this is MU's SDG profile, very heavily weighted towards SDG 3, good health and well-being, and that's been growing the last few years. If we actually want to have a look at this sort of thing in the platform, we can do that. So if I have a look at Thailand in general, and then if we come to our analytical views, we've got research categories. If we have a look at Sustainable Development Goals, we can see how these are classified and the citation performance of these. We could have a look at a timeline and see there's significant growth in usually the big two, good health and well-being and affordable and clean energy. We could look at a heat map. We've got the SDGs down this side. We could have a look at the organizations on this side and see where organizations in Thailand's SDG profile sits. So huge preponderance here with MU's SDG 3 is making all the colours go here. You can see there's a particular area of specialisation for King Mongkut's University in affordable and clean energy as well. One thing we can do is I made a group for all of the 17 SDGs. I just can get them all at once. And then we can have a look at the organizations. So we're just looking at the publications that are SDG publications in Thailand. And we can see MU leads the pack in terms of volume and also hugely in terms of the citations on those. Again, if we look at our field citation ratio, we get a slightly more precise picture of that citation performance. And what's also interesting is to look at something like the percentage of those publications that have altmetric attention. SDG publications in general tend to have a higher rate of public uptake. So you can see just under half of those publications have some kind of altmetric attention to them, and that's significantly more than the others, except perhaps for the Ministry of Public Health. So that's something about the way the research is being disseminated. And we could take this kind of analysis further, actually, and push this out into our Altmetric platform. Sorry, I'm just going to get your publications again. Close that too soon. Yeah. So if we wanted to have a more in-depth look in the aggregate level of what kind of altmetric attention your SDG-related publications get, I could press this Altmetric Explorer export button. And we have actually a separate interface for looking at this altmetric attention. And this will let us see a different view. The citation view is very important. It tells us what's happening in terms of scholarly attention. But the altmetric view tells us something more about uptake and engagement and social impact, perhaps. So I'm just loading this up. So on here, moment. Taking its time. Yeah, so you can see that of your SDG research, we've got a lot of social media mentions, news mentions, mentions in patents and policy, and other sources like Wikipedia, but also even YouTube, people mentioning the research in YouTube. It's always interesting to look through the altmetric data because you never find out how the research is being mentioned or used, and there's always surprises in there for how people are talking about it. So you can see some of these YouTube videos, but we can see on a timeline let's pull that in a little bit. So there's a growth in mentions here. Because of Twitter being the light blue, it's very noisy and accounts for a lot of the data. So we can just look at particular things like news mentions or policy mentions. There's quite a lot going on in January 2015. We can wonder what that was about. Or these other types of mentions as well. If we did want to go and look at something like the sources of those mentions, we could do that and just have a look at, say, the policy mentions and which are the sources that are most mentioning your research or your SDG related research, that is. That will come up in a moment. And sometimes this one takes a few seconds to load. So while it loads, let's come over to, got way too many tabs open now, but we're nearly done, so it won't be too many more. We have a journals tab in Altmetric Explorer. So you can actually see which journals are generating which kinds of attention. So if we look at which journals are generating the most news mentions, we'll see that 2 articles are actually generating 358 news articles from the British journal Sports Medicine. Nature is also a great platform for attracting news mentions. But then if we look at it a different way and look at patent mentions, you'll see a very different profile of journals that are getting that are responsible for generating mentions of those kinds. You can see those. Whereas if we look at blogs, that will be a slightly different picture as well. Blogs here means scientific blogs. So that can be quite a useful thing. You can look up particular journals in there as well. Just to come back to this one, still hasn't loaded for some reason. Should come up in a moment. While I do that, let me just look at the chat. Data sets. Yes, data sets are a great addition in Dimensions. And again, researchers are publishing their data in so many different places, in different repositories. So because we're indexing around 900 different open data repositories, you can really start to see where researchers are active. And if you publish the data, it it comes through, and data sets are getting their own citations and attention now, so that's another kind of metric of engagement and impact. I'm not sure why this is taking so long, but it's probably the last thing I need to show you in here as well. So I guess what I've shown you today is a whole array, like a Kontiki tour of different things that you can do in Dimensions. Hopefully that gives you some ideas of the scope and the breadth of the platform. I would really love to have the opportunity to hear from you about what was interesting to you and what you'd like to dive into deeper. If you're interested in having a trial of the platform, we're very happy to set that up for you. Can come back and do a more detailed presentation on anything that you want to see, or to give you an orientation to the platform if you want to trial it. I'll just wait for this to load, but otherwise I think I can give you the time and hand it to you, Siddharaj.
Thank you, Danu. Yeah, thank you for your presentation. And I would like to open the floor for the question again. If you have any question, please feel free to send your question to the Q&A box and also to the chat. And the chat box sent to all panelists, so all the panelists and Danu can see the question. And also you can put the raised hand to asking for turn on the microphone to ask the question directly to Danu. So, yep. ตอนนี้จะเปิดโอกาสทุกท่านได้ถามคำถามกับทางคุณดานูนะครับถ้าเกิดมีคำถามต้องการส่งคำถามมาทางช่องทางนี้นะครับก็คือทางช่อง Q&A นะครับทางช่องแชทส่งมาที่ panelist นะครับเพื่อที่เราจะได้เห็นข้อความของท่านนะครับแล้วก็ช่วยกดปุ่มยกมือเพื่อขอเปิดไมค์นะครับตรงนี้จะสามารถถามคำถามกับทางคุณดานูได้โดยตรงนะครับทางทีมห้องสมุดจะเปิดไมค์ให้ท่านนะครับเดี๋ยวผมขออนุญาตเช็คข้อความนะครับในแชทและ Q&A นะครับจะดูว่ามีข้อความคำถามเหลืออีกไหมนะครับ
Yeah, so this question here, can I compare both institute and faculty? I think we had a go at that before.
Yeah.
And say if you have, so the short answer is in the platform, everything is at the whole of institution level. So we don't know the faculty structure of other institutions. If you want to do this for your own faculty and you know the list of people, yes, you can do that. It's a matter of getting the list of people and either searching for them in Dimensions and creating a group, or we work out the Dimensions IDs for them and pull that information from the Dimensions API and build a report that way. Happy to show you some examples of what that looks like and send that through. I don't have that right here with me now, but if that's interesting, I can send that through to you.
Okay, thank you. Any question? มีคำถามอีกไหมครับผม Danu, actually, I have one question for myself. Actually, now the Thailand Academic Institute is quite proactively working on the research work related to SDG. My question is, what is the mechanism of the dimension to classify the research work for SDG?
Yeah, thank you, Raj. That's a great question. I think probably what I would say is, we have a report that goes into this in some detail about the methodology, but essentially we took a list of publications that partners that we worked with agreed were SDG related, and we worked with many partners from many academic institutions and community organizations to create that kind of validated list. And then we use that to train an algorithm that can now reliably classify articles as to whether they are SDG related or not, or to which one. So it's all done through machine learning and natural language processing based on supervised machine learning. So I've got a report that goes into the technical methodology behind that and exactly how that's done that I'm happy to share with you as well. But that's the short answer.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. Yeah, I think it'll make a lot of more sense. And one last question I see on dimension itself. Can we change the funding about to other currency, because we can see it's a New Zealand dollars, right? Is it possible to change to other currency like euro or US dollars?
Yes. Thank you for mentioning that. This is actually, I always forget before I start the demo to change the currency because it always defaults back to New Zealand dollars. And then I do the demo and go, oh, it's New Zealand dollars. But yes, you can have a number of presets. We have US, euros, pounds, yen, Australian dollars. We don't have baht, unfortunately, at this stage, but we do have those major currencies.
Okay, thank you for your answer. โอเคครับถ้าไม่มีคำถามแล้วนะคะเดี๋ยวผมขอจะจบช่วงนี้แต่เพียงเท่านี้นะครับThank you Danu for your presentation today. Thank you for staying with us very late. I know that it's about 8:20 in your time. Yeah, thank you very much again.